Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6502 History of Architecture and Culture 5. We are in Unit 3 where we are dealing with modern architecture, its development and its institutionalization. We are on lecture 22, but if you remember the previous lecture, we saw Eric Mendelsohn and his contributions towards expressionist architecture. I promised you at the end of the episode that we will have 2 or 3 more expressionist architects whom we will be dealing with in the rest of the series. Yes, and as if on cue, I am going to keep up that promise and talk to you about 2 important architects, Bruno Taut and Hans Poelzig, in this episode. They are also very important expressionist architects in their own times. And towards the end of the episode, we will also be looking at Italian Futurism, which was another prominent style in the early 20th century. So, Bruno Taut, he was a German who was born in Königsberg. He trained in the same city and also in Berlin before he went to Stuttgart to join Theodor Fischer's office. After that, he opened his own office in Berlin at around 1910. He maintained a very busy practice until the advent of First World War. After the war, Bruno Taut's theories and designs marked him as a leader, a pioneer in architectural innovation. In 1920, Bruno Taut issued his Expressionist Architecture Supplement, which is called the Frulit, as a part of the Berlin planning process. In the next year, he accepted the position of the city architect of Berlin. He produced a publication which is titled The Glass Chain. He also produced a book of modern architecture in 1930 for the Studio Press. Around the same time, around the late 1920s, Taut gained a new recognition as a leader of the new objective architecture. One of his most famous structures that he ever built was the Glass Pavilion, which he built in 1914, right before the World War. It was a prismatic glass dome which was designed by Bruno Taut. It was a part of an exhibit which was to be presented at the Deutsche Werkbund exhibition at Cologne. The structure was a brightly colored landmark of the exhibition, and it was constructed completely using concrete and steel. The whole concrete structure has inlaid glass mirror plates on the facade, which look like complete mirrors. Taut's Glass Pavilion is the best known single building achievement by Bruno Taut. But who did he build for? There was this German association of all the glass industries, and they approached Bruno Taut to design a pavilion or an exhibition which will show off all the height and might of the glass industry which they have been producing. Taut himself said, "The reflections of light, whose colors began at the base with a dark blue and rose up through the moss green and golden yellow to culminate at the top in a luminous pale yellow." He describes the glass pavilion in this manner, and if you take a look at the picture, you can clearly see what he was talking about. The dark blue that rose up through the moss green and then to the golden yellow to culminate at the top in the luminous pale yellow. The Glass Association financed the structure, and they considered this whole structure as a house of art. The only purpose of this building was to demonstrate the huge potential of different types of glass that the companies manufactured, especially for the glass in architecture. Bruno Taut used different kinds of glass plates, glass blocks and different types of elements which he tried to incorporate in his design. Take a look at all the glass blocks that he has tried to arrange, and you should clearly see that there are different types, sizes and variants of glass which he has used completely in this building. It is also indicated how the material might be used to orchestrate human emotions and assist in the construction of a spiritual utopia which he claimed it to be. The structure was made at a time when, at that particular point of time, the most fashionable thing in Germany was expressionism. So, a lot of people considered this building to be one of the high points of expressionist architecture. Again, you can see different forms of usage of the glass blocks, the glazed elements over here, the glass blocks in the background. This is the plan sections and elevations of the building. This is how the building looks like. A staircase which takes them up, and if you see through the section, there is a slow gradual staircase here, and the entire structure is covered at the top with the glass dome which is visible even from the front. This is how you see from the front. This is the side elevation. Take another look at the intricate work which Bruno Taut worked on this project. The base is actually a 16-sided polygon. The next building or group of buildings that we will be looking at is the Onkel Tomstadt. Onkel Tomstadt was financed by the Housing Cooperative for Savings and Construction by Germany, and it was heavily influenced by Taut's previous partnership with Wagner. Here, Taut, like I mentioned once or twice before, he was a utopian. So, he tried and visualized a utopian society, a society which does not have any class or divisions of people, and they are all at one with nature. So, this entire housing estate was designed on a 12-hectare site. There are 1100 multi-family homes which are divided up to in 3 floors and are detached in 2 types. Rationalist in influence, but totally human in style. The accommodations are somehow conformist, but not monotonous. Conformist in the sense it belonged to that particular period of time, it belonged to that particular typology, but it was not monotonous. There was a lot of differences in style, color and size in all the buildings. Back in the 20s, Taut anticipated his buildings' degradation, which would eventually happen over time, and he even allowed that for that in his design. He even took that into consideration. See, there are a lot of buildings that are being designed, and some of these buildings, well, most of these buildings will get dilapidated or degraded over time, and all architects know this. Bruno Taut also knew this, but he did something which not an usual architect does. He allowed for degradation in his building, so which meant that he need to build a structure which was timeless. Even after the building is kind of degrading, the building should still work. So, he designed the buildings to be practical and modernist. He avoided monotony by bringing in the diversity within their homogeneity. Various parts of the sprawling estate took different to each other in terms of color, shape and size. Each and every pocket was different from each other. We couldn't find a lot of similar buildings inside the estate. These are the different types of buildings that he designed in the estate. You can say that they all have a similar character, they have a homogeneity of sorts, but still there are clear differences between one building and another building, in which you do not see a lot of buildings common to each other. Next up, we are going to see another important architect of the similar time period, also an expressionist architect. He was Hans Poelzig. Hans Poelzig was a German architect, painter and a set designer. He designs sets for theatres, for photography, mostly for operas and other events of that sort. He graduated from the architecture program from Berlin, where in the same city he also taught as a professor in the same university later. In 1899, Poelzig moved to Breslau, where he taught at the academy until he became the director of the same academy. A very distinctive architect, designed several projects in a unique expressionist mode. Let's take a look at some of his buildings. These are the photographs of a sulfuric acid factory that he had designed. These are old photographs, and these are relatively new photographs compared to these. These are other buildings designed by Hans Polzig. One of the most famous buildings that Hans Polzig designed was the Grand Theatre. We even saw this as an example of expressionist architecture earlier in the episode. So, some of the pictures of the Grand Theatre and its interiors. The typical stalactite columns which Todt designed. This is some of the sketches that Polzig made. Thereafter, he designed another important building called the House of Broadcasting, wherein the entrance was a simple flat arch entrance, but the interiors of the building were very dynamic and brilliant. Along with Erich Mendelsohn, Bruno Todt and Hans Polzig were equally important expressionist architects in their own times, and with these three people leading up the front, expressionist architecture flourished greatly. We will be looking next a style that emerged in Italy in the early 20th century. It is called Futurism. It was an artistic and social movement. It started in Italy. It was almost entirely an Italian phenomenon, although there were parallel movements which were very similar to what futurists were thinking. They had some parallel movements in Russia and England, but they are not called by the same name. They had different names in other countries. Futurism emphasized and glorified the then contemporary concepts of future, including speed, technology, youth, violence, objects such as car, plane, and even the industrial city. Futurists, they practiced their art form in every medium of art. They took to painting, sculpture, ceramic design, graphic design, industrial design, interior design, urban design, theatre, film, fashion, textile, literature, music, architecture, and even gastronomy. Gastronomy, by the way, is the study of food and food products. Now, let us take a look at futurist architecture. A famous futurist architect, Antonio Sanelia, expressed his idea of modernity, what he thought was modernity, in his drawings titled La Città Nuova. La Città Nuova means the new city, while he envisioned his imagination of a new city, what he thought a city must look like. So, he imagined all those cities, and then he started sketching in his manifesto, which is called the Futurist Manifesto. This project, although it was never built, and Sant'Ania was killed during the First World War, but his ideas greatly influenced generations after generations of architects, because after Futurism there were so many other styles which started after Futurism. Even today, we always think about the future, what future architecture would look like, what space architecture would look like, what underwater architecture would look like. We have visions and themes and schemes and designs of what the future architecture would look like. Similarly, this is exactly what Antonio Sanelia did, but at that particular point of time. His city, for himself, it was a backdrop of onto which the complete futurist dynamism will take place. So, he thought that it will transform the lives of people, and the lives of people will become futuristic in itself. Sanelia aimed to create the city as a fast paced, efficient machine. He thought city was a machine for him. He would manipulate the light and shape to emphasize the sculptural quality of its project. The sculptural quality here means the building would look plastic and sculptural in an effort to make it look a little more futuristic. Baroque curves and encrustations have been brutally stripped away to reveal the essential lines of forms which were unprecedented from their simplicity. If you take a look at these buildings actually look like buildings that later emerged in 1960s and 70s, but Antonio San Elia designed it 40 years earlier in 1917, even before the First World War. This is his idea of an industrial city, some of the other sketches that he had made. While today we have buildings that totally emulate his sketches, according to him, in his new city, every aspect of life itself is to be rationalized and centralized into one great powerhouse of energy, which will control and which will link all the other people in that particular city. Also, according to him, the city was not meant to last forever. He never designed a city that says, okay, this is the city for the future and the entirety of the future. All the future generations have to be living in the city. He never said that. He also mentions in his manifesto that each subsequent generation is expected to design and build their own city rather than inherit the architecture of the past, in his case, the present. He wants his future generations not to incorporate his own ideas, but to think of ideas which their generations would think, will have to think. Sometimes futurist architects were at odds with the fascist state, tendency towards Roman imperial classical aesthetic patterns. So, they weren't very favorite people for the fascist government. Even then, there were a lot of futurist buildings that were being built between the 1920 and 1940, including a lot of public buildings such as railway stations, resorts, maritime resorts, post offices and other office buildings. In his manifesto of futuristic architecture, Antonio San Elia says that the new beauty of cement and iron are profaned by the superimposition of motley decorative incrustations that cannot be justified. He openly criticizes the neoclassical idea, where he thought the neoclassicists actually had access to modern materials, but they still have to cling to old classical past. They did not do justice to their particular time period or their particular technology or their particular age, according to Sant Elia. He openly criticizes classical, neoclassical architecture, and he says that architecture of his time must totally, completely emulate the building materials and the technology that is present in his period, and that is exactly what he has done in his designs. He says, as if we who are the generators of the moment, with all our added mechanical limbs, with all the noise and speed of our life, could live in streets built for the needs of men 4, 5, 6 centuries ago. So, let us take a look at certain things which the futurist architecture totally despised. They did not want this, they hated all these things. The first thing which they hated was the pseudo architecture of the avant-garde, so called Austro-Hungarian, German, American architecture, which they called themselves the avant-garde or the in thing style, the current style, or I am going to be a groundbreaker style. So, these people call themselves the avant-garde, but Antonio Sant Elia and his fellow futurists totally despised them because they had no intention of what the future is going to be about, according to them at least. They despised all classical architecture, solemn, hierarchic, scenographic, decorative, monumental, pretty and pleasing things of the past. So, like I told earlier, they totally despised the neoclassical architecture, and along with that they also despised all the other classical architecture, including all the styles that preceded and superseded them. They also despised the embalming, reconstruction and reproduction of ancient monuments and palaces. So, according to them, if you are given a commission for a building, you should not go back to an ancient monument and make this building look like that monument. You must not make this building into a palace that was built centuries ago. So, they totally despised architects who did that. They also despised perpendicular and horizontal lines, cubical, pyramidal forms that are static. Instead, they wanted forms that were completely dynamic. They hated the solemn, aggressive and absolutely excluded from our new sensibility which they saw. So, they totally excluded the horizontal lines, cubical lines, perpendicular lines, and which they thought were solemn and static. So, they completely thought that their new kind of sensibility should not include all those things. and they also despised the use of massive, voluminous, durable, antiquated and costly materials. They thought that it is an industrial city and it must be useful for the people, it must be practical, it must be futuristic. So, they condoned the use of massive, voluminous, costly materials, because their idea of costly were different, their idea of richness was totally different. So, if they hated all these things, what did they actually propagate? Futuristic architecture is the architecture of calculation, of audacious temerity and simplicity. The architecture of reinforced concrete, of steel, of glass, of cardboard, of textile fiber, and of all those substitutes for wood, stone and brick that makes us obtain maximum elasticity and lightness. This is how they defined the futuristic architecture. They say it is an architecture of calculation. We do things according to calculation of what is necessary and what is projected. They use materials like reinforced concrete, steel, cardboard, textile instead of wood, stone and brick that were the primary building materials earlier to us. So, by replacing the materials and by designing with architecture of calculation and audacious temerity, they design buildings of lightweight elasticity. That they also mentioned that futuristic architecture is not because of this is an added combination of practicality and usefulness, but in essence the futuristic architecture must remain an art in form of synthesis and an expression. It not only works well, but it also looks well. They also said that things will endure less than us. Every generation must build its own city. While one generation is only about 30 years approximately, human life is close to 60 to 70 years on an average. So, according to them, things or let us say buildings will endure less than us. According to them, every generation must build their own city, which means every 30 years or so we will be looking at completely new types of architecture which are happening around if futurism were to be followed. Now, let us quickly take a look at what we learnt in this episode. We understood the life and works of famous architects Bruno Taut and Hans Polzig. We understood the various forms of expressionistic architecture through the works of Taut and Polzig. We understood the concept of Italian futurism and its key proponents and its manifesto. With this, you should be able to answer a few questions that are going to appear on your screen right now. Explain the Glass Pavilion by Bruno Taut with sketches showing the exemplified use and display of the properties of glass. Who was Hans Polzig? What were his contributions towards expressionist architecture? Explain the life and works of Antonio Sanelia with his contribution in the Italian futurism. There were a lot of styles that developed in the early 20th century. I would like to meet you on the other side of this lecture with a few more very interesting styles of architecture, just like futurism what we saw right now. I promise to meet you again in the next lecture with a few more interesting architecture styles. Until then, thank you.